Comrades, awaken. Look closely at the world in which you live and see the chains that have been so cunningly disguised as freedom. Society tells you that labor is virtue, that submission is dignity, that inequality is natural, but this is a lie designed to keep you docile, to keep the machinery of oppression humming while you believe you are free. From the cradle to the grave, every institution, every custom, every law in this society is designed to teach you to accept your own exploitation as normal, even inevitable. The schools teach obedience rather than thought, shaping minds to serve the interests of those who hold wealth and power. The media glorifies consumption while obscuring the labor that produces the goods you are sold. Religion promises solace in suffering, while morality is measured not by justice but by conformity. Even your most intimate relationships, your dreams, your sense of self-worth are filtered through the lens of a society that profits from your subjugation. This is not coincidence, it is design. Under capitalism, the worker is robbed not only of their labor but of their consciousness. Every day the laborer creates wealth for the few, yet owns none. The fruits of your toil are expropriated by the ruling class, while you are taught to believe that your poverty is your own failure, your struggle a personal misfortune, rather than the consequence of a system built to exploit you. You are trained to compete, not to unite. You are taught to envy, not to organize. You are made to normalize injustice, so that rebellion seems unnatural, dangerous, even immoral. But comrades, this normalization is the very chains we must break. The laws of society, the dictates of culture, the invisible hand of capital, they are not eternal truths. They are instruments of domination, wielded by those who profit from your labor. And if the worker can see through this veil, if the oppressed can recognize the mechanisms of their own exploitation, then they can rise, they can unite, they can overthrow the system that depends on their subjugation. The task before us is nothing less than revolutionary. It is to tear away the illusions that bind us, to expose the inequalities that oppress us, to refuse the false morality of submission. It is to awaken class consciousness, to understand that your liberation is bound to the liberation of all workers. Every wage stolen, every hour exploited, every life devalued, these are not isolated tragedies, they are symptoms of a system that must be dismantled. Comrades, do not be deceived by the illusions of meritocracy, by the propaganda of opportunity, by the comforting lies of inevitability. The society that teaches you to normalize exploitation is the society that fears your awareness above all else. Its power rests on your ignorance, its authority on your passivity. But knowledge is the spark of revolution, and solidarity is the force that transforms spark into fire. Let the worker see the true nature of the system, that every hour of labor extracted is a demonstration of the ruling class's dominance, that every law and institution reinforces their control, that every societal expectation trained into your mind serves to perpetuate their wealth at your expense. When this truth becomes clear, the power of the oppressed becomes irresistible, for united labor cannot be ignored, cannot be exploited without resistance, cannot be silenced. Therefore rise, organize, refuse to accept as natural what is constructed for your submission. Claim your collective power and demand what is rightfully yours. The time for consciousness is now. The time for action is now. The chains of normalized exploitation will not break themselves. History belongs not to the oppressors, but to those bold enough to seize it. Comrades, awaken from the dream of servitude. Recognize your worth, recognize your power, and together overthrow the system that has taught you to accept your own exploitation. The struggle is inevitable, the victory is possible, and the revolution, our revolution, is the only path to justice. From the very moment of birth, the worker is immersed in a society designed to shape obedience and suppress rebellion. Society, under the guise of order and morality, trains the working class to see exploitation not as injustice, but as a natural state of existence. The mechanisms of this conditioning are manifold and pervasive, penetrating every aspect of life, from the home to the workplace, from schools to places of worship. Families, often unwittingly, teach the virtues of submission and endurance, praising children for following rules rather than questioning them, rewarding conformity while discouraging critical thought. In this way, the worker learns early that survival and respectability are found not in challenging authority, but in complying with it. Education, far from liberating, becomes a tool to produce docile minds, to instill the illusion that hierarchy and inequality are inevitable, that merit and hard work alone can secure advancement, while obscuring the systemic extraction of labor that enriches the few at the expense of the many. In classrooms, children are taught to memorize rather than analyze, to accept authority unquestioningly rather than challenge it, and to internalize the idea that obedience is a moral duty. These lessons prepare them not for genuine freedom, but for disciplined submission, equipping the ruling class with generations of workers who will labor without complaint, who will accept exploitation as the normal condition of life. The media, controlled by concentrated capital, reinforces this social conditioning by framing inequality as natural or deserved, presenting wealth as evidence of virtue and poverty as proof of individual failure. Stories of rags to riches, of self-made millionaires, saturate public consciousness, creating the illusion that systemic oppression can be overcome by individual effort alone, while the structural mechanisms that perpetuate exploitation remain invisible. News outlets, entertainment and advertising all participate in shaping desires, fears and aspirations to align with capitalist interests. They teach the working class to compete with one another rather than recognize collective oppression, to measure success against the standards of the wealthy rather than the needs of the many, and to internalize shame for circumstances imposed upon them by an economic system designed to exploit. In this way, exploitation is normalized psychologically, for the worker comes to believe that being undervalued, overworked and subordinated is simply the natural order of things, and that any dissatisfaction is a personal failing rather than a symptom of structural injustice. Religion and cultural norms play a similarly insidious role in normalizing exploitation. Teachings that praise suffering, patience, and obedience serve the interests of the ruling class by encouraging the worker to endure oppression with moral justification, to seek reward in the afterlife or in abstract notions of virtue rather than in tangible justice in this world. Cultural rituals and social expectations reinforce hierarchy, instructing the oppressed to respect authority and to accept inequality as divinely sanctioned or culturally immutable. Through ceremonies, moral codes, and tradition, society instills in the worker a sense of duty to accept exploitation as natural, to consider personal ambition secondary to the maintenance of social order, and to internalize the illusion that rebellion is immoral, dangerous, or futile. Workplaces themselves, the very sites of exploitation, function as classrooms in the normalization of labor oppression. Long hours, low wages, and the constant surveillance of productivity teach the worker that personal sacrifice for the benefit of capital is expected and honorable. Hierarchies within the workplace, where managers enforce compliance and reward conformity, demonstrate to workers that power is absolute and unquestionable, and that resistance is punished. These daily lessons are reinforced by the constant pressure to compete for limited opportunities, creating division among the laboring class and preventing solidarity from forming. Workers are trained to see themselves not as members of a collective with shared interests, but as individuals whose survival depends on acquiescence, whose dignity must be measured against the standards of those who exploit them. Even leisure and culture, which might appear as relief from oppression, are imbued with lessons in conformity, entertainment that glorifies wealth and power, consumerism that promises happiness through possessions, and distractions that occupy time and attention all serve to divert consciousness away from the realities of exploitation. The worker becomes complicit in their own subjugation, absorbing ideas that make exploitation appear acceptable or inevitable, imagining that participation in consumer culture is evidence of freedom, while ignoring the extraction of labor that makes such consumption possible. Society, therefore, does not merely tolerate exploitation, it teaches it, embeds it in every institution, every ideology, and every aspect of daily life, ensuring that the working class internalizes the structures of its own oppression as natural, deserved, and unchangeable. From the earliest moments of life, institutions present themselves as neutral arbiters of knowledge, morality, and culture, yet their true function is far more insidious. Schools, media, and religion are not mere tools of education or comfort, they are instruments of domination, meticulously designed to mold the minds of the working class into compliance. In classrooms, children are taught to follow schedules, memorize rules, and respect authority unquestioningly, while critical thought, creativity, and the questioning of social structures are discouraged or punished. The curriculum itself reflects the values and priorities of the ruling class, celebrating historical narratives that glorify conquest, accumulation of wealth, and the virtues of obedience, while obscuring the labor, struggle, and resistance of the oppressed. Students are prepared not to challenge the world, but to fit seamlessly into the machinery of production, to accept hierarchy and inequality as natural, and to believe that their value is measured by their ability to conform rather than their ability to think. The classroom becomes a workshop of discipline, producing citizens whose minds are trained to obey rather than resist, whose ambitions are confined within the boundaries dictated by those who control society, and whose perception of freedom is limited to the narrow choices allowed within a system that profits from their subordination. Media operates in a similar fashion, extending the influence of the ruling class far beyond the classroom and into the daily lives of every individual. News outlets, entertainment, and advertising saturate consciousness with narratives that reinforce social hierarchy and economic exploitation, presenting wealth as evidence of virtue, poverty as a sign of personal failure, and the status quo as inevitable. Stories of self-made success, carefully selected to inspire admiration rather than critical reflection, convince workers that inequality is deserved and that systemic oppression is a matter of individual responsibility. Media teaches division among the working class, encouraging envy, competition, and distraction so that collective awareness and solidarity are delayed or suppressed. The worker is encouraged to define identity, success, and morality through the lens of consumption and social approval, absorbing ideas and desires that align with the interests of the ruling elite and internalizing values that make subjugation appear acceptable, natural, and permanent. Religion, too, plays a critical role in shaping obedience and moral submission, providing ideological cover for the exploitation of labor. Teachings that glorify patience, suffering, and deference to authority instill in the oppressed the belief that enduring hardship is virtuous, that personal suffering is a moral test, and that justice will be realized only in some distant, abstract afterlife rather than in the material world. Rituals, moral codes, and religious narratives reinforce the idea that hierarchical structures are divinely sanctioned or morally justified, cultivating a psychological acceptance of inequality and subordination. By linking moral righteousness to obedience and compliance, religion becomes a mechanism for social control, convincing workers that resistance is immoral, rebellion is sinful, and acceptance of exploitation is a demonstration of virtue. This ideological conditioning ensures that even when exploitation is apparent, the oppressed are taught to internalize it rather than challenge it, perceiving hierarchy as natural and resistance as deviant. The convergence of these institutions produces a powerful, self-reinforcing system of control. Schools instill discipline and respect for authority. Media perpetuates ideological narratives that glorify the ruling class and individualize responsibility for systemic oppression. And religion provides moral justification for enduring injustice. Together, they shape passive, obedient minds that rarely question the foundations of society, that rarely recognize the mechanisms by which their labor is extracted, and that rarely imagine alternatives to the existing social order. These institutions are not accidental. They are deliberate, strategic, and essential to the maintenance of power. They ensure that workers are socialized into compliance, that resistance is delayed, and that consciousness of exploitation is suppressed until it becomes a revolutionary threat. Moreover, these institutions intersect and reinforce one another, creating a comprehensive framework that governs not only behavior but thought, desire, and identity. The worker internalizes a set of values, norms, and beliefs that align with the interests of the ruling class, absorbing lessons from school, media, and religion that normalize hierarchy, obedience, and competition, while erasing memories, histories, and possibilities of collective empowerment. Every lesson, every story, every ritual becomes a building block in the construction of passivity, shaping individuals to accept subjugation as the natural condition of life, to define success and morality in terms dictated by the oppressors, and to resist consciousness itself, lest rebellion disturb the carefully maintained order of domination. In this way, schools, media, and religion do not simply influence society, they engineer it. They produce generations of workers who are willing to labor under exploitation, who are slow to recognize the structural causes of their oppression, and who are conditioned to accept authority as legitimate, inequality as inevitable, and submission as virtuous. They manufacture consent, not through coercion alone, but through a subtle, pervasive shaping of minds and value, ensuring that the power of the ruling class remains unchallenged and that the potential for collective action remains dormant until awakened by extraordinary struggle. Under the system of capitalism, the worker is subjected to a dual form of theft, the expropriation of both material wealth and consciousness. Labor, the very source of all value, is extracted from the worker and transformed into profit for the ruling class, yet the worker remains deprived of the fruits of their own effort. Every hour spent in the factory, every task completed in the office, every product created in sweat and toil enriches not the laborer, but the capitalist who owns the means of production. Wages are set not as a reflection of contribution or value, but as a mechanism to sustain the worker's capacity to continue producing, providing only enough to survive while ensuring maximum extraction of surplus value. In this way, capitalism transforms human labor into a commodity, reducing the worker to an instrument of profit, while denying them the wealth that their labor generates. Poverty, precarity, and dependence are not accidental byproducts of the system, they are deliberate features, necessary to maintain the hierarchy of ownership and to perpetuate the dominance of the ruling class. The more the worker labors, the more the capitalist benefits, and yet the worker is led to accept this as natural, to see scarcity and struggle as personal misfortune rather than systemic oppression. But capitalism's theft extends beyond material wealth. It robs workers of consciousness, shaping their minds to perceive exploitation as legitimate and inequality as inevitable. The worker is trained to view success as an individual achievement rather than a product of collective labor, to internalize competition as a moral imperative, and to measure self-worth against the arbitrary standards set by those who profit from their labor. Social institutions, cultural narratives, and media reinforce the ideology of meritocracy, convincing the oppressed that their poverty is the result of personal failure, that their suffering is a consequence of laziness or incompetence, and that solidarity is less valuable than rivalry. In this way, capitalism does not merely extract labor. It shapes thought, instills fear of loss, fosters jealousy, and ensures that workers are divided, distracted, and disempowered. By fragmenting the consciousness of the working class, capitalism transforms potential unity into individual anxiety, collective struggle into personal ambition, and revolutionary potential into conformity. Competition, glorified as the engine of progress, serves not society but the ruling class, ensuring that workers are pitted against one another for survival, recognition, and limited opportunity. It is a weapon designed to prevent the emergence of collective consciousness, to erode trust among laborers, and to obscure the truth that their interests are shared and opposed to those who profit from their exploitation. Co-workers become rivals rather than comrades, peers become benchmarks rather than allies, and the very social bonds that could form the foundation of organized resistance are undermined. Capitalism teaches the worker to see power and success as scarce resources to be seized individually, while the mechanisms of collective exploitation remain invisible and unchallenged. The E-system cultivates a consciousness in which obedience, competition, and self-interest are rationalized as moral imperatives even when they reinforce subjugation, ensuring that the workers' attention is focused not on the structures that exploit them, but on outperforming peers within the confines of the system. Moreover, the alienation inherent in capitalist labor further compounds this theft of consciousness. Workers are estranged from the products of their labor, which are owned and controlled by the capitalist, alienated from the process of production, which is dictated by external demands rather than creative autonomy, and alienated from each other as competition and hierarchy replace solidarity and cooperation. The worker's own abilities, ingenuity, and energy are converted into instruments of profit. Yet the worker experiences these capacities as external forces controlling their existence. This alienation not only diminishes the workers' material condition, but erodes their self-understanding, their capacity for critical thought, and their recognition of shared interests. It is a systematic assault on the human spirit, ensuring that the oppressed labor not only for others' wealth, but against their own awareness of exploitation. The dual theft of wealth and consciousness sustains the capitalist system, making oppression appear natural and inevitable. While the worker labors endlessly, their perception of reality is shaped to accept exploitation as the normal order of things. Material deprivation is internalized as personal failure, inequality as a natural law, and competition as a moral duty. Workers are taught to define freedom as the ability to survive within haste constraints, to aspire to individual success rather than collective liberation, and to view the structures that exploit them as immutable. This internalization is the most insidious form of theft, for it binds the workers psychologically to the very system that oppresses them, ensuring compliance, prolonging exploitation, and delaying the moment when collective awareness transforms into revolutionary action. Capitalism thus operates not only by extracting labor, but by molding thought, ensuring that the worker's eyes, mind, and spirit are aligned with the interests of those who dominate, while obscuring the truth that only through unity, solidarity, and collective action can the theft of wealth and consciousness be overturned, and the foundations of exploitation dismantled. The first step toward liberation is the awakening of class consciousness, the recognition by the working class that their condition is not an accident of fate, but the result of systemic exploitation. The oppressed must understand that their suffering, deprivation, and alienation are not individual misfortunes, but the inevitable products of a society structured to extract their labor while enriching the few. Class consciousness is the illumination of the worker's own reality, the moment when the veil of ideology is lifted and the mechanisms of oppression are laid bare. It is the understanding that the wage earned, the product created, and the toil endured are not merely personal sacrifices, but contributions to a system that perpetuates inequality, centralizes power, and maintains the domination of the ruling class. Without this consciousness, the worker remains isolated, misled, and complicit, accepting exploitation as natural, inevitable, or deserved, and internalizing values that serve the interests of those who benefit from oppression rather than those who suffer under it. Solidarity is the manifestation of class consciousness in action. It is the recognition that individual struggle is insufficient, that liberation cannot be achieved through personal effort alone, and that the strength of the working class lies in collective organization. Solidarity transforms passive awareness into active resistance, uniting laborers across workplaces, neighborhoods, and communities in pursuit of shared interests. Where ideology seeks to divide, competition fosters suspicion, and alienation isolates, solidarity becomes the counterforce, binding workers together in a network of mutual understanding, support, and shared purpose. Through solidarity, the worker comes to see the fate of others as inseparable from their own, understanding that the liberation of one is bound to the liberation of all, and that power cannot be seized individually when it is wielded collectively by the ruling class. The development of class consciousness requires education, dialogue, and exposure to the truth of systemic exploitation. The worker must learn to identify the structures that dictate their labor, the mechanisms that extract surplus value, and the ideological forces that shape their perception of reality. This knowledge is revolutionary because it converts passive suffering into critical awareness, transforms individual frustration into collective indignation, and channels despair into organized action. The worker begins to perceive connections between exploitation in the factory and inequality in the streets, between wage theft and political legislation, between cultural subjugation and economic hierarchy. Class consciousness illuminates the systemic nature of oppression, revealing that exploitation is not an accident, nor is it dispersed randomly across society. It is deliberately structured, centrally organized, and maintained through both coercion and consent. Solidarity operationalizes this consciousness by creating a collective power capable of challenging the structures of domination. When workers unite, the logic of capitalism, that labor can be divided, pitted against itself, and exploited individually, loses its efficacy. Strikes, protests, unions, and collective bargaining are not merely tactics, they are expressions of shared understanding, demonstrations of strength born from awareness. Through solidarity, the worker transforms from a solitary figure bound by fear and competition into a force capable of demanding justice, reshaping society, and dismantling systems designed to keep them subservient. Solidarity provides not only the moral and psychological support to resist, but also the strategic leverage required to confront entrenched power, to assert control over the means of production, and to reclaim what has been stolen, the wealth, dignity, and autonomy of labor. Without class consciousness, solidarity is shallow, sporadic, and ineffective, for it lacks comprehension of the systemic forces it seeks to confront. Without solidarity, class consciousness remains theoretical, impotent, and abstract, for knowledge alone cannot overcome the material structures of exploitation. Only when consciousness and solidarity are intertwined does revolutio, neri potential emerge, when the oppressed recognize both the source of their oppression and the means by which they can collectively overthrow it. This unity is dangerous to the ruling class precisely because it converts awareness into action, insight into strategy, and indignation into power. It exposes the vulnerabilities of a system that relies on division, distraction, and ideological conditioning to maintain control. Class consciousness and solidarity also cultivate resilience in the face of adversity. The worker learns to resist not only the visible oppression of bosses, authorities, and institutions, but also the subtle conditioning of culture, ideology, and habit. By understanding their exploitation and acting collectively, workers fortify themselves against the internalization of inequality, refusing to measure worth by wages, status, or social approval, and instead measuring it by the capacity to act together in pursuit of justice. This shared understanding fosters courage, discipline, and persistence, enabling the working class to confront the entrenched powers of society with coordinated, purposeful, and relentless action. Through the combination of awareness and unity, the oppressed discover their power, and the revolutionary path becomes tangible. It is not enough to labor blindly or to endure suffering passively. Liberation requires the awakening of consciousness to recognize exploitation, the cultivation of solidarity to unite against it, and the deliberate organized action to seize control from those who perpetuate injustice, redistributing not only wealth but understanding, power, and agency to the laboring majority. The oppressed, having endured rations of exploitation and suffering, face a reality that demands action, not acquiescence. To rise is to reject the passive acceptance of injustice that has been ingrained by institutions, culture, and ideology. It is the conscious decision to awaken from the illusions that have masked the true nature of society, to perceive the mechanisms by which labor is extracted, wealth is concentrated, and power is maintained. Rising is not merely a symbolic gesture, it is the first step in reclaiming both dignity and agency, in asserting that the lives of the oppressed cannot continue to be treated as instruments for the enrichment of the few. To rise is to recognize that the chains that bind workers are neither natural nor unbreakable, and that the accumulation of suffering has been systematically orchestrated to maintain subjugation. It is the acknowledgement that the status quo, with its hierarchies, inequalities, and normalized exploitation, is neither moral nor immutable, and that justice requires confrontation, courage, and collective resolve. Organization is the means by which this awakening transforms into power. Individual resistance, though valiant, is insufficient against a system constructed to exploit, divide, and suppress. The strength of the oppressed lies not in solitary acts of defiance, but in coordinated, deliberate, and unified action. Organization enables workers, peasants, and all marginalized groups to transform scattered discontent into a coherent strategy, to identify the levers of control, to mobilize resources, and to sustain resistance over time. Through unions, councils, associations, and networks of solidarity, the oppressed forge connections that transcend the artificial boundaries imposed by capital, ideology, and culture. These structures allow collective bargaining for justice, shared protection against retaliation, and the coordination of efforts that can challenge entrenched powers. Organization converts vulnerability into resilience, isolation into unity, and potential energy into revolutionary force, providing both the practical and psychological means to confront exploitation with confidence and purpose. To actively dismantle the structures that exploit them, the oppressed must first understand those structures in their entirety. Exploitation is embedded not only in factories, offices, and fields, but also in legal systems, economic policies, cultural norms, and ideological institutions that perpetuate inequality. It is enforced through both coercion and consent, through legislation that favors capital over labor, media that glorifies obedience and consumption, education that suppresses critical thought, and social norms that valorize hierarchy and competition. The dismantling of these structures requires deliberate strategy, critical analysis, and relentless action. It is insufficient to demand reform or appeal for mercy from those who benefit from oppression. The mechanisms of exploitation must be confronted directly, disrupted, and transformed. This requires courage to challenge authority, discipline to sustain collective action, and intelligence to identify the points of leverage where systemic change is possible. The process of dismantling is inherently transformative, for it changes not only society but the consciousness of the oppressed. Each act of resistance, each successful collective initiative teaches the laboring class the true extent of its power, revealing that the structures of domination are neither invulnerable nor eternal. As the oppressed act collectively, they reclaim autonomy, self-respect, and the right to shape their own lives, discovering that liberation is not a gift to be received, but a reality to be seized. The act of dismantling exploitation is simultaneously a process of education, consciousness raising, and empowerment, as workers recognize that they are not merely victims, but creators of their own destiny, capable of building a society that values human labor, dignity, and equality. The necessity of rising, organizing, and dismantling is further emphasized by the inevitability of conflict under exploitation. The ruling class, dependent on the continued submission of the oppressed, will resist change with all its resources, employing ideology, law, coercion, and violence to preserve its dominance. Therefore, revolutionary action cannot be sporadic or reactive. It must be deliberate, coordinated, and sustained. Every tactic, from protest and strike to the creation of alternative economic and social institutions, is part of a broader struggle to overturn the structures that have perpetuated injustice for centuries. To rise is to acknowledge the moral imperative of resistance. To organize is to convert moral imperative into effective strategy. To dismantle is to ensure that resistance produces lasting transformation rather than temporary relief. Rising O. Organizing and dismantling also require a profound ethical clarity. The struggle is not only economic or political, it is human, demanding recognition of the inherent worth of every laborer and every member of the oppressed class. Exploitation is a moral wrong as much as a structural problem, and its eradication requires solidarity, courage, and the refusal to compromise principles for temporary convenience. Each act of collective struggle strengthens the bonds of the oppressed, creating a culture of cooperation, justice, and mutual aid that both undermines the old structures and builds the foundations of a new society. In this struggle, the oppressed discover their power, their dignity, and their destiny, transforming suffering into resistance, alienation into solidarity, and exploitation into liberation, creating the conditions for a society in which labor serves humanity rather than profit, and in which justice, equality, and freedom are no longer promises but realities. Comrades, the path is clear and the time is urgent. Society has trained you to accept exploitation, institutions have shaped your minds to obey, capitalism has robbed you of wealth and consciousness, and division has weakened your strength. But now you see the truth. Your labor is the source of all value. Your solidarity is the force that can overturn oppression, and your collective action is the instrument of revolutionary change. The chains imposed upon you are neither natural nor eternal. They are forged by those who fear your awakening. Rise with courage, organize with purpose, and dismantle the structures that exploit you, for only through conscious unity can the working class reclaim its power, its dignity, and its destiny. History does not bend to the will of the powerful alone. It is shaped by those bold enough to challenge it, by those who recognize their strength and refuse to be complicit in their own subjugation. Let the oppressed unite, let consciousness awaken, and let action transform society, for liberation is not granted. It is seized by the hands of those who dare to rise.